Thank you, Vinny, and thank you, Anant, Amrut, and Krithi for joining in, and everybody who is in the participants watching us today. CWS has been doing a lot of webinars in the past, but this is a little off-track webinar. It is not about wildlife and the researches CWS is doing. It is about how the grassroots NGOs like CWS, Search, and Dasra, who have their ongoing programs, are actually doing and delivering the impact while the pandemic is on. Though we all know second wave is hitting. The first wave, we just barely got out the first wave, and the second wave was even worse. And we all know the numbers, how high they went. So all this conversation will be around how we as NGOs or non-profits are going to continue delivering the impact that we want, or how we are changing the methodology and the impact that we want to focus on. So I'm happy to, let me just stop sharing my screen here, and so that everybody can see the panelists. Great. So I'm very happy to have Anant from Dasra and Amrut from Search and Krithi from Center for Wildlife Studies joining us today. And this webinar, all of us have been part of Dasra leadership program as well. So it's almost sort of a reunion for us. So thank you and welcome on board. Just before we start, I'll just give a small introduction of what each of us do. So Amrut is a joint director of Search and leads the program called Nirman. It's a youth-based youth initiative in Maharashtra, and Nirman aims to identify and nurture organized youth, India's youth, and to encourage them to solve civil society's challenges and give them a sense of purpose. He has led Nirman since 2008 and is involved in strategy, partnerships, recruitment, fundraising, and project management. He also holds a MS in nonprofit leadership from University of Pennsylvania, where he received prestigious Richard J. S. Global Citizenship Award for demonstrating commitment to social impact. And we also have with us Anant. Anant leads the capacity building team at Dasra, which works with other NGOs and at different levels of maturity to strengthen their leadership, accelerate their growth, and help them achieve the desired impact. Anant has an MBA from Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, with 18 years of experience in various sectors such as marketing, sales, consulting. Anant is passionate about applying skills he has learned in the consulting space to solve issues in the social sector. And that's what makes him a very important participant here, considering he will be able to share his experience with other NGOs and how they are pivoting in times of crisis. And we all know we have Krithi Karanth, Dr. Krithi Karanth with us, who is Executive Director and Chief Conservation Scientist at Center for Wildlife Studies. And she is a PhD from Duke and MESc from Yale 2003, PSA and BA degrees from University of Florida. She is world known for her contribution towards wildlife and conservation. And her research in India and Asia spans 23 years and encompasses many issues in human dimensions of wildlife conservation. She has more than 40 awards and recognitions, which include very recent Wild Innovator Award, Eisenhower Fellowship, and Rolex Award for Enterprises. At CWS, she spearheads 3 programs: Wild Seve, Wild Surakshe, and Wild Shale, and now another program which we are leading immediately, Adopt a PHC program, which is towards working with primary healthcare centers in the wildlife reserves. So welcome all of you. And just a little bit of myself, I am Sumit. I very recently joined Center for Wildlife Studies as one of their associate directors, and I'm heading technology and partnerships here. So again, welcome all of you and welcome all the participants of the webinar. So we'll just start, jump right in and start from, Amrut. So Amrut, first wave was just barely over before it hit the before India hit second wave. Let's talk about after the first wave went over. How was Search and Nirman as a program was rebuilding itself to, and reimagining itself on how the program should run now? And what was your strategy around it? If you can brief up a little bit.
Thank you so much, Sumit and CWS team for inviting me to this webinar. Just to give a context of Search, we are based in the district of Gadchiroli on the easternmost corner of Maharashtra. And we have a residential campus of around 45 acres called Shodgram, which is our headquarters, where around 100 of us stay and work. And our hospital, our offices are all there on the campus. We have around 150 community health workers who are spread in the villages around and do our health work in around 150 villages. And we have a few other programs which have a scope of either a district or a state or our nationwide. So that's the kind of background of our work and how we're situated. Now, because Gadchiroli is a relatively underdeveloped and remote district, where 200 kilometers from Nagpur, even though the first wave kind of ended in the country or the lockdown ended, it reached us after that. Because till then, the inter-district travel in Gadchiroli was also banned. So the first wave started in Gadchiroli in around September end. And it ended in around December, I would say. So in that sense, we were also a bit unfortunate because the time gap between first wave and second wave was even shorter for us in Gadchiroli as compared to what it was for many others. When we got this glimpse that probably now there are going to be waves after waves, how do we go about? And because we have most of our work in the domain of healthcare, we couldn't shirk off. In fact, our need increased during this particular course of the pandemic. So the first step that we did was protect and empower our own staff, our own residential staff on the headquarters as well as our field staff. So right from health education, giving them PPE, giving them various masks, hand sanitizers, all sorts of equipments, life and medical insurance, and getting them vaccinated. All of them got Covishield vaccinated. So this is something that we did so that we were able to do a next program. We run a hospital here, which caters to around 50,000 patients annually. So we decided to include COVID care as part of our hospital. So once the first wave got over, we got ourselves a testing facility. All of us are aware that even in big cities, if you go to do RT-PCR testing, it takes around 5 days to get the report, which basically makes it meaningless. Because by the time probably your isolation period should also come to an end. So you may not believe this, but in the forest of Gadchiroli where we are, we have in-house RT-PCR testing facility and we can give you report in 1 hour. So right from RT-PCR to antigen to having oxygen concentrators, having indoor facility for corona treatment, and now even the vaccination unit. So our hospital has been recognized as a government center. So that's where we did, and that's where we kind of pushed our corona care to the hospital. We also started our community health workers to do massive health education and symptom tracing in the community in around 108 villages. Mixed response because people have a very weird notion about what would happen to you if you're caught with corona symptoms. And I'll talk about it later in response to some other question. But this is what we did. We also started telemedicine because many of our doctors could not either come here, or some of our old physicians, it was risky for them to actually go in the hospital. So we started telemedicine facility for medicine, orthopedics, etc. Some interesting opportunities were also opened. So we run a program called Muktiban, which fights alcohol and tobacco in the district. We have had a fair bit of success with alcohol, but regarding tobacco, we are in the minority because 51% of the adult population of Gadchiroli consumes tobacco. So we, who were opposing tobacco, were in the minority always, and we couldn't crack that problem so easily till yet. But during Corona, the government issued the guidelines saying tobacco will contribute to increasing of Corona, and we lapped onto it. And surprisingly, even trader communities in Gadchiroli gave us support. And so, amidst the crisis of Corona, we could still have much better impact on tobacco, what we were not being able to have in the past few years. And finally, I will also say that we run a adolescent health and sex education program called Bhang, which was more face-to-face. We decided to bring it online. And within the last 2-3 weeks that we have started bringing it online, we have had around 20,000 viewers. So continuing with some of the programs, shifting the focus in some of the programs, taking certain programs online, these were some of the ways we decided to go ahead. We also figured out that this is a good way for us to work internally on our campus. So we have decided to make it carbon neutral and have planted around 4,000 trees in the past 2 months. So because we were forced to have some internal focus, we also used it for bettering and contributing to the environment. So these were some of the things that we did. So
lovely. So as you just rightly mentioned, some of the NGOs had their hands full while the the pandemic hit, and how you started with rebuilding your programs and the shifting focus was very commendable. So I'll quickly shift to Center for Wildlife Studies. Krithi, would you tell how you were building or reshifting or reshuffling the programs while the first wave was about to end, or how the organization was shaping up during the pandemic?
So I think we have we come from a very different perspective than Amrut does. We are a wildlife conservation NGO. We do research, conservation on ground, education, and policy. We don't work in healthcare at all. Last year, when the pandemic hit, we were about to launch a community education program to work with community leaders on the ground, healthcare workers, and the forest department to educate them about human-wildlife conflict. This is people losing lives, being injured, or they're losing property or having their crops damaged by wildlife. As the pandemic hit India in March, we looked into and did research on the 6 most common zoonotics found in the Western Ghats, ranging from Maharashtra down to Kerala. And we identified that other than COVID-19, there are 5 other zoonotics common to this part of the world where we work in. And so we designed and extended what we eventually called the Wild Suraksha program. We launched the program in September. From September to March, our teams in Karnataka and Goa spanned over 11 wildlife reserves and engaged 4,000 frontline health, forest department, and community leaders, educating them about zoonotics and conflict. And the goal also is to eventually build out a very formal wildlife diseases program. Yes, now there's a huge debate on, was this thing lab released or did it come from the wild? But no matter what, human tinkering in nature, getting into remote forested areas will continue to happen. And there is potential for not just these zoonotics to spread, but new ones to emerge that we don't even know about. So long-term CWS will build a very strong wildlife diseases program. And what happened, so we couldn't do much in terms of on-ground action. We could do research, we could do community outreach and build a network of people. But then this year, when the second wave hit us, I think there's just a growing sense of frustration amongst a lot of us saying, we're seeing this country falling apart in so many different ways. Can we do more other than being locked up at home? And I saw that in all the CWS team, in the research staff, in the conservation staff, and the education staff. And what we did was very quickly call the ASHA workers, the doctors, the forest department staff who we had met through the Suraksha program, and basically in about 3-4 days figured out that primary healthcare centers remain the node for delivery of healthcare in India, particularly in these areas where we work, like Amrut. They're very remote, they're hard to reach, and they're understaffed often, and they certainly don't have the supplies they need to deal with this as this wave rolls out of the big cities and into the most remote parts of India. So I'm very, very proud to say in a span of 2 weeks, the entire CWS research, conservation, and education teams came together and everybody worked on this Adopt a PHC project. We launched it 2 weeks ago. By this weekend, we would have reached 44 PHCs in rural Karnataka. And by next week, we should get rolling in Goa. Of course, we started with 100 PHCs in mind, but our list has grown to 231. And I foresee this growing to somewhere between 500 and 1,000 who we can immediately reach. So again, we are not a healthcare NGO, we're a wildlife NGO. We believe in building better relationships between people and wildlife. And I think enabling and supporting people during a crisis like this is catering to our strengths, and long-term community relationships are critical. So I'm very proud to see where CWS is. And I just want to kind of connect this to Anant, because last year I remember we were having all these discussions on NGOs changing their mission because of the flood of funding coming in, NGOs staying core, true to their mission. And I think last year we stayed absolutely true to our mission of saving wildlife and wild places. But today, I'm very proud to say we've added on to our mission and added this health component, but in a very meaningful way. We're not doing it because we feel like doing it. We are doing it because we need to do it, and we can do it, and we'll do it well. So thanks.
Thanks, Krithi. I think the two programs, Wild Suraksha and then Adopt a PHC, do represent how we are, as a CWS, we are trying to pivot and adding onto our missions. I'll get into a little more details on Adopt a PHC and Wild Suraksha, but quickly let's move on to Anant. Anant, Amrut and Krithi, Search and CWS are two ends of spectrum. So one is purely healthcare and one is purely wildlife conservation, who has tried to get into a little bit of health work, but essentially there are two spectrums. So, but you come in the middle, like you have seen a spectrum from this end to that end. So tell us from your experience, how a lot more other NGOs you are working with, how they try to build back better after the first wave started, and what is your experience been?
Yeah, no, thanks, Sumit, and hi everyone. So as I was listening to Amrut and Krithi, I recall our conversations. I think it's I think the one silver lining in all the mess is the speed and the focus of the response that, in whatever way, the civil society has been able to do. I was chatting just in the first half with Gravis, right, who works in Thar on drought resiliency, but again at the villages and how they are being able to be of service, and in some shape and form, even as Dasra, though we are, I'd say, one step removed, are seeing what we can do to sort of direct funds, etc. I did want to also, though, highlight a couple of inputs we are picking up from the field, which also means there's so much more to do. And with your, if that's okay, Sumit, I'd love to share with the group, not to say, not to create a sense of like, okay, there is a Mount Everest to climb. No, but the fact is, if we are aware of the challenges, then I'm almost certain that someone in this group will find the right kind of pivots. And in a way, we have demonstrated that if we know what to do, and we sort of even have 2 weeks to do it or 4 weeks to do it, we can do a far better job than sometimes gets done in the field. I did want to, it's a little provocative, I'd say, some of the statements. So please, I did want to make sure that you sort of apply your own judgment to this, but some of these are inputs we are picking up from the field, and many of you are working in the field. So I think the first point is, lurching from crisis to crisis is almost something we, unfortunately, as Indians in Mumbai, I can speak from very unfortunate experience, we almost take pride in, and it's a problem, because when this happens and if this becomes a pattern, the people who suffer the most are the poorest of the poor. They are the most vulnerable. So we have to find a way to think ahead of the next crisis. I think the second point is, the reality is, and I'm not even getting into which vaccine is more effective or less effective, but even if you take all the most optimistic and the most pessimistic projections, it's going to be almost like end of this year, middle of next year, maybe even sometime in the end of next year, that everyone is safe. If we were to use that as a simple yardstick, and many of you are working with communities who potentially might be, some of the people who get that protection at the very end. This basically means vulnerabilities will actually increase now. The challenge is, with vulnerabilities, people forget that it exists the moment the headlines are gone. So just to give you an example, and this is something I personally feel the most shaken up by, schools have been the great equalizer for girls and boys, for tribal communities, for rich and poor. I mean, forget about whether they are good schools or not so great schools, but they are the equalizer. Now with schools not existing, and school openings will potentially be one of the last things to happen, because while adults dying is very, very painful, a child dying can get a politician out of his seat. So if that actually plays out, we might have 2 to 3 years of loss, right? Now, what does that mean? It means that people will say, look, so digital is the solution. But the reality is the most vulnerable, frankly, get excluded by digital, unfortunately. COVID has proven that, right? So there is something needed in a very, very big way on education. And unfortunately, education has been one of those, because one can choose to postpone, one has postponed, but it will come back to bite all of us in a very big way. So for people who are working in education or can support education or can help those who are working in education, it's an opportunity of a lifetime. Adolescents, the reality is we are going to have a generation who will basically get into the work-life zone and will find an economy which is fractured. So what happens? And then women will be potentially the most affected, because I think even in the scheme of things, very unfortunately, there is a pecking order. So how do we make sure a generation doesn't, the demographic dividend doesn't come to flip around? Again, this can be changed, but people in this room have to make that change. Health, and Krithi, I'm so happy that you did whatever is possible with PHCs. The diseases of the poor, I just take an example of tuberculosis. They are making a comeback. It's unbelievable. But the issue is, there is a hesitancy to go to a hospital now, very rightly so, and very naturally so. But what that means is diseases of the poor and things like maternal mortality, things that should be eliminated, will actually come back. So, and then the point is, what about mental health? Because that's a hidden pandemic. And again, this is going to affect those who are in the most stressed out situations. So, in a way, I'm not going to get into all of them. Micro enterprises, as people work at homes, micro enterprises will go into a zone of low productivity. So unless something is done to protect those small scale industries, we will find millions of those who could actually be very productive move out of productivity. And the big myth of digital, I think at least this group knows about it, but just to call it out, digital is not a panacea. It's a very powerful tool, but it's potentially not a panacea to helping the vulnerable. So how can then this group think about, okay, what next? And while obviously focusing on the current crisis, even today, there are declarations of success happening in the media, right? The problem with an exponential curve is it goes up very fast and comes down very fast. But the real question is, how will we protect the vulnerable? And I think between this group, there are people who work in all of these sectors or multiple sectors. How can we pivot our models to actually safeguard the most marginalized is potentially a question of a lifetime. But thank you, Sumit.
Well, great, Anant. So that definitely highlights the danger we are getting into, and then how the humanity as a whole has been affected by the pandemic. So I'll come back to the same on how operations of an NGO are being impacted, because a lot of us do feel that while we are working with the communities, while we are trying to stay true to our mission of helping more and more people, the first and then the second wave again have blocked our efforts significantly. So I want to bring a focus about how we know the numbers on how different was first wave and the second wave, but how has the first and second wave impacted the organizations differently? So I would start with Krithi now. Krithi, would you mind to mention what was different in the first wave and what is different in the second wave, and how we are trying to manage that in Center for Wildlife Studies?
Well, I think last year we went deep diving into financial crisis right away, right? Because all the CSR funding that was committed to CWS and our various programs immediately got wiped off the table starting early April. So it was, can you hold on to the ship? Can you make it not sink? And what can you hold on to? And what do you need to cut back on? I think this year is very different because we are able to directly engage in a meaningful way in COVID relief. We have found new supporters, new donors, and I think it's also really brought the team mentally together, because instead of 60 of us located all over India just struggling with our workloads and yet seeing this unfold and not being able to help, now there's a sense of, at least as CWS, as an organization, all different parts of the organization have completely come together. People are working, 12, 14-hour days. There's energy, there's excitement, there's passion. And I mean, so I think we're in a much better mental space because we're able to do this and actually help in a small way.
Okay. Is it right to say that the first wave was more of a fear and the second wave is more like an opportunity for us to think through and directly engage to it?
I think it's also, taking time to think about what can you do meaningfully, right? And not just jump on the bandwagon. I mean, even with the second wave, you saw everybody kind of focusing on the big cities, on oxygen concentrators. That's still going on. A lot of foundations we're talking to only want to do oxygen concentrators. And I keep telling them, out of our 231 PHCs, there's 10 of them that need oxygen concentrators. The other 221 need basic protective equipment and medical supplies. So this disconnect between the haves and the have-nots, rural and urban India, continues to grow. And I think, we've always worked in rural India. And so that's where we're comfortable and that's where we can do something,
Well, great. So Amrut, you being directly into healthcare, I mean, the first wave, it's hard to figure out the difference between the first wave and second wave for a healthcare NGO. But would you want to share some of the insights from how you see that impacting your organization?
I think before we speak about what happens about the change in the NGO, I think it was very interesting and slightly sad for us to see the change in the mindset of rural people. And in case of first wave, probably there was too much of initial scare when the wave wasn't so bad or wasn't so serious. But by the time the second wave came, I think people have lost their patience. And second wave is much more serious, much more lethal, and spread at a much faster and higher rate. And people were probably much more casual and did not want to heed to any kind of a precautionary measure. And I think that kind of complicated the overall health scenario too much. When we speak with rural people, we also find out that there are too many misconceptions that they have. For example, not all of them are unfounded. Some of them have their own reasons for them. But for example, if you want to if you are seen with symptoms, you will be taken for testing to a government center. There, if you are found to be COVID positive, you will be put in isolation, will not be able to meet with anyone. There you usually die. If you die, the dead body is not given and your kidneys are taken out and sold. So this is the conception people have. And that's why people don't want to even share the symptoms. Because if you share symptoms, the rest of the chain will kick off. Even about vaccination, there is tremendous terror that if you get vaccinated, you will die. If you get vaccinated, you will not have children. So I can't fathom who are the sources of this kind of rumors, but I think they are doing a great damage. Because of which it is becoming difficult to implement health programs, not just for the government, even for the NGOs. And even we had some setback related to that. The second wave spread so fast that, for example, Gram Sabhas could not be conducted. There was because of the 144 section, we couldn't conduct Gram Sabhas. So, which was like our primary way of engaging with the community. Now, if you can't have a Gram Sabha, how would you interact with the community? There was quite a bit of construction going on our campus. All of that had to be halted. So on a variety of measures, there was indeed setback that we experienced. But then we also said that what are some of the other things that we can focus on? And I already spoke about the hospital care and ramping it up to enable it to give COVID care. That was something that we did. We also saw how is it that we can expand the impact of our activities even to places where we can't physically reach. So for example, the Nirman Youth program that we run, through that, young MBBS doctors who come and be part of our program. So they were inspired to go and serve in rural PHCs. And I'm really proud to say that in the last 2 months, 28 young MBBS doctors from our program have joined at various health facilities across Maharashtra. So that is something that was a small contribution that we could do. We also focused on some of the advocacy efforts and the advocacy that we did with the government of Maharashtra by responding to an appeal that Chief Minister had made. And we had a very timely intervention, because of which now 1,000 doctors are being posted in various government facilities across the state. So although we had to probably pivot some of the programs that we were actively doing in Gadchiroli, we also decided that let's take this time to pull up all the levers that we can and create impact also at a local level, but maybe also at the state level, wherever we can. So that's something that we tried.
That's very interesting. So on the higher level, right now, both the waves actually make people think, how do I impact few lives which are around me or the communities I work with? But it's also important to see how the bigger change can happen. But Anant, from your experience again, you already talked about the pivots we should take, the kind of vulnerabilities that we are that are increasing. But from an NGO's perspective, for a person who is trying to work with some communities, their work was halted. And then let's say if they were not a healthcare NGO, they were completely on stop. And then while they were trying to build up, the second wave hit, and then they are again at the stop. So while some of the NGOs like Center for Wildlife Studies figure out how they can work and do much more meaningful stuff with the communities they work with, but what are the general pivots have you seen so far during the second wave specifically?
Yeah, and I think just from what Amrut also said, I think large number of the pivots have taken the best of what was working and started doing it much more aggressively. So just to take an example, I think in education, the biggest pivot has been how do we preserve the child's educational journey? Some NGOs have found extremely innovative means, including couriering the books to the home and doing telephone classes. And the reason the telephone classes is such a brilliant idea is the feature phone telephone class, which basically just ensures that 50 students are at least listening to one teacher, and the teacher is taking the kids through the books. May not be perfect, but it establishes a minimum level of communication and learning. So I think lots and lots of nonprofits have taken the best of what they had, seen how to break through the access barrier. The biggest challenge which has happened was the access. Having said that, I think what's one difference, if I can point out from what the data we picked up is, in the first wave, it was like a shock to the full sector. It almost, like Krithi, you said, right? Everyone was like, how do we survive? And it was pretty, because capital was sucked out of the sector in a matter of few weeks, right? And again, whether it was PM cares, whether it was other things. This time, what sort of happened is because there's been so much publicity. I mean, if you look at CNN, India was pretty much on that for, 3-4 weeks. So money has come in, but the sad reality is education and livelihood sector NGOs have got really, really disadvantaged in the bargain. So I think that has been a slight difference between sector wave 1 and wave 2, also in terms of the capital, the money flows.
Thank you. That's a very logical segue into the next section on. Let's talk about finances now. So the first wave, as you simply mentioned, a lot of money was sucked out. But let's talk about how the current donors of a lot of NGOs were working and were trying to give the flexibilities to their grantees. So Amrut, let's start with you. So how has been your relationships with the people who have been working with you or partnering with you or being your donors has been during the first and the whole pandemic way? So how a lot of flexibilities they would have given. So just explain that a little bit, and then how it has again, the second wave again is hitting those things again. Yeah. So just explain that a little bit.
I think the non-dependability of CSR funds, which kind of struck the whole sector, is, I think, a common pain point shared by all of us. And I think there probably some serious introspection is needed by the CSR authorities. That does science and not succumbing to pressure play any value in the judgment that they make? And is PM Cares the most efficient way of spending money, especially to be thought of corporates who usually teach NGO sector of being inefficient? So I think that's a thing that they should think about. We were in the first wave when we started our community healthcare program. We were very fortunate that Azim Premji Foundation supported us for 6 months for doing it immediately. But after that, as Krithi mentioned, even we faced somewhat of crunch. Some of the donors were only hell-bent on Corona and not shifting in any way. But we were also fortunate that most of our old donors stuck with us. MacArthur Foundation gave us a lot of flexibility for even non-Corona work. When we were facing some crunch related to some of our core programs, which were non-Corona, we approached, let's say, Rohini Nelekani, who had been here just weeks before the pandemic actually started. And I'm really fortunate to people like her who understood the importance of not focusing only on Corona, but also supporting non-COVID activities, which are crucial for the health of the community. So because of such people, I think we were able to manage our finances well. I must also congratulate the foresight of our trustees who had built some organizational reserves. So, and one of our common friend Madhukar once told me that very few NGOs in the country have been able to build reserves which they could go back to when such kind of unprecedented crisis hits. And I think it's to the foresight of our trustees. But we also made use of some of those reserves so that we had decided that we'll not cut down on any of our core things if it is important. At the same time, I think such kind of a crisis are also good opportunity to see if we are being inefficient somewhere, if there is some redundancy or some flap that has gotten in, and to get rid of that. So we also had some appraisals from that kind of view. There was some attrition which took place. There was some layoff also which took place, but only at a very at the bottom level, or I would say at that level of performance, which was probably just unacceptable. But probably we had not thought about it otherwise. Corona kind of forced us to look at our own inefficiencies. So I think that's also a good thing that the crisis brought in. We also explored crowdfunding, and we had not done it so seriously till date. But during Corona, we also did that, and that has also partly helped us. But I think there is a lot of scope for us to improve upon that. But in general, I think the entire NGO sector must have realized the importance to diversify and have relationships with mature donors who can support you during this crisis, who can withstand pressures to divert money, and who understand the importance of all sorts of programs, not just COVID programs and oxygen concentrators.
Thank you, Amrut. That's very important. And then the reserves that you mentioned, I think has served a lot of NGOs, but a lot of NGOs still grapple because they have not been able to build that big of reserves. So Krithi, would you want to shed the light on how our relationships with the donors have been during the pandemic?
So actually, Amrut captured most of what I would have said. I think for us, long-term donors like Oracle, like Cisco, all of them stepped up and gave us a huge runway in terms of completely changing some things, continuing things at a slower pace. But I think it also gave us time to really deeply reflect on what else can we do, right? And this Wild Connect platform that you're involved in, we built that because of the pandemic, because we all had time to actually pause and reflect on what else can we do. So strengthening internal systems, processes, and that continues even today. I think, like Amrit said, I've also personally come to recognize and value donors in a different way. I think finding people who are there for the long term is really, really important. And people who, so we lost a lot of, we lost all our CSR funding, right? Yeah, right, last year, right? And CSR was 25% of our budget. And Indian donors don't give to wildlife. A large majority of our donors are not from India, and they will never give to wildlife. It's just, that's the reality, and we were hoping to change that. But I think what's happened this year is that a lot of people have realized that, we work closely with communities who live with wildlife. And in terms of quickly, both the research capabilities we have as an organization and the tech connection and the management capabilities, we're able to very quickly do stuff which I hadn't appreciated of our own in terms of our own strengths, right? And I'm very excited this year because we are finding new supporters, and they may come to us because of COVID and that's what they care about. But knowing that we've survived and existed for 37 years, they will realize all the other work we do, and I hope some of them stay the long term. So we're finally reaching out to new people who would have never, would have never touched our lives. And I think, but at the same time, reiterating what Amrit said, you can't just accept money for the sake of it, right? You need people who truly believe in you long term, and not just because it's a fad or this is a thing to do for the next couple of years.
And that's very important, not to have donors, but long-term partners. I think that's where everything lies. So Anant, I'll come to you, and now I'll actually want you to take a macro view on this, and give your insights on how other the donor organizations, not really on the non-profits, but how other donor organizations are dealing with this pandemic, and how do they support their grantees now? What is the shift that is happening? I would also want you to touch upon how general scenario in the country is happening with the FCRA, as Center for Wildlife Studies purely depends on FCRA, and the FCRA rules being tightened up, and during all of this happening during the pandemic, which is in itself is a second wave of challenges that NGOs are facing. So if you want to touch upon these certain aspects and give your macro view on the thing.
Sure, and I think Amrut and Krithi covered some of the key points, and this is obviously a all of you are living, breathing this every day. So many of these challenges have also, we've seen a little bit of a cycle. So I'm going to just take a step back and rewind a little bit to when the first wave hit, right? Because some of that might give some clues of what will happen now. So, when the first wave really hit, I think two things happened. One, the corporate profitability completely stopped. So CSR commitments were reneged within 2 weeks' notice, and this happened almost without exception, and also because PM Cares took out most of the CSR. So CSR went out very, very quickly. Obviously, a lot of the redirection of capital then happened towards healthcare. What was interesting to see is once the first wave started coming down a little, the first to come back with a plan were the foundations. In many cases, they were, both the Indian and foreign foundations. So in a way, they were asking the question, saying, okay, how do we now think of our future investments? So I think what was interesting was foundations set the stage for how should we be bolder and think about the future. And one very positive fallout which happened was community-centric organizations who had been almost marginalized in the last 10 years, because of a huge focus on big bets and a huge focus on SDGs. They suddenly came into the center stage because, what became very clear is, everyone else will go away. The final two people will stay with the community, with the on ground is the community-based organizations, volunteers, and those who are change agents. And of course, the government the machinery will be there. So I think that sort of happened, and that then led to money flowing to CBOs and much more. I think the second thing which also happened was a lot of the individual givers started becoming far more keen to give. And I think one can attribute that to the tremendous media cycles which happened. For example, on migrant labor, we saw a dramatic upswing in how much focus was there. I mean, the issue was always there since independence. Migrant labor have been living in Mumbai next to, very, very rich people, but I think it came into the focus. So CBOs and migrant labor suddenly became visible. So a lot of invisibility became visible. Unfortunately, the FCRA rule basically led to subgranting stopping. So that basically stopped a very significant source of funds to CBOs. So right now, the big question is, will Indian givers actually rise to the occasion and start focusing on community-based organizations who may not be very savvy, who may not be metrocentric, who may not speak English, who may not be very great in donor reporting, but potentially do some of the most fantastic work. So that's really the open question. We are hoping that happens, and we are seeing early signs that will happen. Thank you.
Thanks, and that's a very key insight. Do you want to touch upon the FCRA and the other organizations and other rules a little bit, if anybody wants to touch upon those?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to take questions, and maybe others can also. But I think the big, I'd say the big trend that we have started seeing is, while there is a lot of donor interest from abroad, especially Indian diaspora, their ability to give is basically through the FCRA, right? So I think that's why it's very, very critical. And one of the things Dasra is doing is it is raising money and raised money from diaspora in USA, UK, and then really trying to find organizations it can support. So we are seeing the dichotomy. On one side, the awareness and the willingness of foreign, especially families or individuals in diaspora, to give us shot up because the visibility is very high. But the funds flow to the CBOs has become difficult. So I would just say that is the big trend we are seeing there. But happy to take any questions later.
Great. So we have only 15 minutes left for to end this webinar. I would actually want to get into a very a different topic on this. Would be on how you are managing your employees, because I think around this time a lot of unrest has happened. First wave was a different, then we all tried to figure out how do we make our operations better. But second wave came with another different challenges. I know many of us known people, who have by either themselves or their family members either being affected, suffered a lot, or some even succumbed to the second wave. So what steps have you been taking in your organizations to get the employee morales high, get their spirits high, and also keep them involved in the work that we do, considering they all are suffering with different emotions on their own. So maybe Amrut, you want to start on this?
Yeah, I think it's a very genuine issue, and employee morale is always important. But I mean, this crisis, probably the need for that has become much more severe. As I said in the beginning, Search enjoys a different kind of a setup where, instead of all the crisis happening, we still can meet each other and work in our usual office, because the office and the hospital and where I stay are still on the same campus. So I can only imagine how difficult it must be for all the other organizations where they probably haven't met each other or haven't been to their office for 1 year or more. Here, at least we can do that. So that's good. As I responded in the first question, the basic step was to start with medical protection for the staff and take the fear about corona away from their minds. I think we were pretty successful in doing that. I must congratulate our entire Karyakarta team, especially our hospital team, our mobile medical unit team, our community health workers who were going to village or who were dealing with COVID patients themselves and did not shirk away from their duties and followed the precautions in such a beautiful manner that even after 1 year of the pandemic, none of our hospital staff has still got infection, which means they have been following the precautions really well. So that is something that we have been doing. Being here in this community also has some advantages. For example, probably if I wasn't in this webinar today, I would have been playing cricket or badminton. So we have ensured that these kind of community activities keep on happening. But we have also enforced pretty strict isolation rules within our campus, because if the case enters and starts infecting everyone, then everything will come to a halt. So the larger campus, we have broken down into units, team-wise units, where we have frequent testing and we allow the team to intermingle with each other, but two teams won't intermingle with each other. Only the team leaders would meet, that too in an open space on a weekly basis, so that there is a less risk of infection, but at the same time, there is cross flow of information going on. We usually have an annual meeting every year where all the departments present their work and there is combined ideation about what we'll do in the future. For the first time in our organization's history, this year we had to conduct the entire annual meeting online within the campus. So everybody sat in their own offices and we had that meeting. But we had occasional gatherings whenever possible, so as to give the people a sense of unity. We also made quite a bit of provisions, like even from allowing provisions for kirana mal and all the groceries to be brought from the city and delivered to you at your doorstep. if you fall ill, you will be admitted in our own hospital and will be given complete care free of cost with paid leaves, even vacation being made a little liberal, replanning of the duties such that people get to do something new when the usual workload or some of the aspects of the workload cannot be taken care of. What is some of the creative pursuits that you can engage in so that you have something new to do, new to look forward to? So a lot of such personal planning also something we tried. So together with all of this, I think we have been able to manage pretty well. I also experienced that during Corona time, many of the organizations that I've spoken with, including ours, also experienced some amount of attrition. And I think part of it is also to the fact that, yes, the pandemic has made some people gloomy. Either it is because of the tragedies that have happened at their home or because of the distances and isolation that they were feeling. But my personal hunch is that oftentimes people kind of misattributed the cause of the loneliness to the workplace and thought that just changing the workplace would change the outcome. I personally don't think that's the right thing. And how does each employee respond to the situation as a challenge for growing up and engaging in creative pursuits is something that can keep the morale high. That has been the spirit we have tried to follow ourselves and instill amongst our karyakartas.
Well, thanks, Amrut. I mean, just you said you have been very lucky that you have your office and home at the same campus. But a lot of us have not been that lucky. So, Krithi, you would want to mention how the operations and how the employee morale and how the interactions with the employees have been during this time.
So I think we have a very dichotomous organization because the research end of the organization can function pretty much from anywhere as long as you have a laptop and internet connectivity. And we did have pretty flexible work from home. People used to work from home 2 days a week anyway. And then we were able to pivot to 0, 1, 2, depending on what was going on the last year. But 2/3 of the organization is not a research arm. It's a field-based arm where in remote locations across different parts of the country. And there it was a struggle because very much the role that people play is getting out there and doing community workshops through Surakshe or doing school engagement through Shale, or if you're on Wild Seva, you go out and attend a claims case and help find. So all of that came to a complete halt for a while. And then we use the time to retrain staff, build up their skill sets on what they can do. I mean, at least support data entry and all of that kind of stuff. But I think it's truly this year that everybody's kind of come together because this is the one project that everybody's involved in. I mean, from the media team to the outreach teams to research and conservation and education, right? So I think we're in a better place this year. I do think it's affecting people that we don't meet often, and there's a limit to sort of spontaneity and fun conversations because of having to do this virtually. But we did get a break from, fortunately, at least in Karnataka and Bangalore, from July of last year till March of this year, we used to meet. So and people in the field are in the field. We used to go out and meet people in the field. So I'm hoping it gets better. I certainly think human connection in person is extremely valuable. And me personally, I'll never be an introvert again after this. I'll take every opportunity to be an extrovert.
Thanks, Krithi. So Anand, Dasra has been looked up to for all these suggestions and all of these, motivational stuff. So what has been your experience in Dasra? And then what would be the advice that you want to give to other NGOs?
Thank you, Sumit. I think we have had a mixed set of experiences. I think what's worked well was being really in touch with the, everyone, right? About 100 employees. So being in touch with people and getting a sense of where their mind is. And unfortunately, Amrit, I absolutely envy what you just said, right? Like I spent one day in office in March when, the second surge had not started. And, I was hoping it'll start, but then this happened. I think we realized 2-3 things. Everyone is at a very different level of mental peace and mental energy. And one size fits all solutions don't work. So I think just being able to sense where people are and give them the flexibility, I think was one thing which worked very well. I think the Second thing was just finding ways to give like time off, and especially in the middle of the second surge, we gave a 2 weeks off, right? And I think that was very helpful because everyone was going through some degree of strife. But maybe that will need to happen in the future as well, because it's not like this is behind us. I think the last point was, and this may have started a few months back. Last year there was some fascination with Zoom. There was still this hope that we are going to start office in March. So when you have hope like that, then people stay motivated. Something happened last 2-3 months back, and it was very palpable that mental tensions were high. So I think finding ways and means to recognize how to help employees with mental stress, whether it's access to counsel, whether it's just finding ways and means to de-stress, cannot overemphasize, because I think while the sector is doing a lot, I think even as Dasra, as we are trying to see how to raise money and provide grants, I think even hearing the stories through our NGO partners, drives many of us to tears, right? And it's one of those situations where mental stress does build up. So how do we help in that situation? And in some cases, just being able to acknowledge that this is a problem and needs to be thought of is useful. I cannot overemphasize the benefit of counseling and access to counseling, or at least access to helpline. So anything on that zone is we found very helpful. And we also have a slightly younger audience, so we got feedback that potentially was one of the best things we at least tried to do. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. We have one question from our audience, and I think after that we can wrap up. We're just almost at time. So the question is, other than funding, how can organizations maximize their impact? What is the key difference between those who have long-term impact versus those who don't? I mean, I would really want to put this question also in terms of the pandemic. So pandemic, there is one figuring out a short-term impact, like say figuring out the oxygen supply, and then there is a long-term impact on how do you fix the healthcare structure overall. So not in general, but how do you respond to that? How organizations can maximize their impact if the funding, other than the funding, is there scenario? Anant, do you want to take it?
Exactly. Sure, and I'll link it to the first topic or first set of dialogues we had, right? Which is, and let's take a very real example. And I'm going back to education only because that sector has been forgotten right now. I think what's playing out right now is a mega crisis where two or three batches of students will lose out. Now, given that, if NGOs can find mechanisms and ways and means to actually safeguard the most marginalized students, that is really, really special. Now, it might need innovation, it might need collaboration, it might also need very, very different thinking. So I just say, in addition to funding and in addition to relief, if everyone in their chosen area just says who's the most marginalized, who will get affected by the COVID crisis, and how do I protect and ring fence that using my best abilities. And this issue will be there in education, healthcare, livelihoods, forest, you name it. So I think, how do we protect the most vulnerable, and almost architecting our programs around that. We may not get there, but potentially we will discover very, very path-breaking solutions in that process. So that would be my, at least, initial thought starter. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Amrut, do you want to add?
Yeah, I think NGOs also need to realize what is the unique positioning and not just repeat what the government has been doing. Especially in the case of Corona, I think the way government has managed the epidemic is very authoritative, most often very ineffective and inefficient, and has pushed the civil society to fringes. Now, when oftentimes the government is unable to do something, then the civil society is bouncing back and doing what it is that it can do. But I think not repeating what the government is just doing, but thinking about our own unique positioning, not losing faith on the good things that we have been doing. So I don't see Corona forcing us necessarily to change our vision. Corona can probably expand our vision. Corona would probably get added to what we're doing, but there is no need to change focus from the good things that we are doing earlier. If something was required for humanity till 2019, probably it is going to be required in 2021. If it is not required now, probably it wasn't required even in 2019. So we should probably have that critical look. I also think that we need to bring in more science into what we have been doing. Most of the response is humanitarian response, which is important, but oftentimes humanitarian response without scientific evidence only leads to panic and helter-skelter efforts. So many of the messages that we all get about ensuring remdesivir or plasma for somebody, I don't understand how to respond to those. I mean, are we going to go by the science, or are we going to just do something so that it feels good that I have done my part? So I think right from that to doing massive health education, focusing on the prevention aspect, vaccination aspects, I think these are important measures. And based on the latest science, how can we pivot our programs? I think that is going to be an important insight for NGOs to work in the times of COVID and even after COVID.
Thanks, Amrut. Thanks. Krithi, last words from you before we close.
After two wise men have spoken, very few last words. For me, I think fundamentally for us, our mission will always be saving wildlife and wild places. It is with people, it is with local communities. Thanks to COVID, I can actually say that our relationship with these communities will get stronger. But post-pandemic, we will go back and continue to do what we were doing. And now Anant has thrown another new challenge, which already my brain's racking and thinking of how we can, because we do have a conservation education program that reached 20,000 children in Maharashtra and Karnataka last year. And we were planning to expand it to Goa, Tamil Nadu, and Kerala. So I'm sort of thinking, environmental ed, what are the things we can do there? Because we have access to people. That is our strength. We have access to people that most people don't have. And we really need to keep pushing forward and be constructive and optimistic about all of this. I don't believe in pessimism, and I think that's fundamental to all of this, right? We can make a difference. It may not be huge, but we will make a difference.
Well, yes, all the three last statements that we heard actually just give us hope that how we can do better, how we can expand better, and continuing to stay with science and also with the community. So thanks everyone for that. I want to close with a little bit of information about Center for Wildlife Studies. So Center for Wildlife Studies is an internationally recognized center for excellence in the areas of wildlife research, and wildlife conservation policy and education. We have been working in these areas for 37 years. I just joined it, but Center for Wildlife Studies has been doing amazing work in 37 years. So I would actually request all of you to, as crowdfunding has been coming in, so we also need your support. Please add and support how much ever you can to Center for Wildlife Studies, because we are working with the most vulnerable communities, and whatever support we get actually impacts their lives. So with that small funding pitch, thank you, Amrut, thank you, Krithi, and thank you, Anant, for your time. It was a fabulous conversation. I think a lot of us who have been working with NGOs as an employee or are running the NGOs, we understand the challenges we are facing. And I hope we all come out safe and well out of the second wave as well. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Sumit. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sumit.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sumit. Thank you, everyone. Bye. Stay safe.
Bye, guys.
Bye.